Welcome to the Building Newfoundland and Labrador podcast, dedicated to exploring the interesting journeys of the people in the provincial construction industry. Presented by the Newfoundland and Labrador Construction Association, produced by GaleForceWins. Join us as we chat with the inspirational individuals that ensure the continued growth of the construction industry and the province of Newfoundland and Labrador.
Well, welcome back to the Newfoundland and Labrador Construction Association podcast. Such a pleasure to be back in conversation. I'm Alan Dale. With me, as always, my good buddy Jerry Carew. This is Build Newfoundland and Labrador Expo 2023, and we have our first guest here today. Tonya, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us why we should pay attention to you.
Good morning.
Welcome back.
Oh, it's exciting to be back, actually. I mean, this is a great expo. The energy here already this morning feels really good. I'm Tonya Whittle. I am a women's empowerment consultant. I've been doing a lot of work with the NLCA and specifically their women in construction, helping build and consulting on what that's going to look like in the future strategic plans, as well as education and empowerment and leadership series for women in male-dominated fields.
So tell us about women in construction. Is there a lot of work to be done there, or are we on a good trajectory? I know there's a lot of conversations about it, but let us know from your perspective where we are.
So one thing to know is that the NLCA is really innovative and advanced in this conversation. What we're hearing from around, since we started in October, when Rhonda's team invited me to the table to have, these empowering conversations, what we're hearing from across Canada and even some of the US is people reaching out saying, what are you doing? How can we get involved? We need division. So the NLCA is really progressive in getting ahead, of these challenges. Women have always been, in male-dominated fields, but, you walk into a typical room in construction, mining, offshore, oil and gas, any of these places, we're typically seeing, there's one woman in the room or a handful of women in the room. Some of them grew up in the industry, their dads or family had businesses, so they were kind of introduced to it. What we hear a lot in the industry and why this is such a critical thing is my focus as a sociologist is the social and cultural conditioning, and that really changes between genders. Now, we're talking a little bit specifically male-female gender, but then, you have diversity in there as well. For the purposes of what I talk about, I'll stick with male-female for today. But what we see is a lot of women who had to fight to get into the industry, and not necessarily the industry, but they fought their parents, they fought their school systems, they fought this gender idea that it's not a woman's place, it's not a girl's role. Girls don't do that. So by the time women even make it into the industry, they've either had to fight, many of them give up along the way because it's such a struggle. So we need to really get into the social fabric, the mindset, the emotions of women to, teach them that they actually do belong, that there's not just a place here, but, one of the things that I talked about last week in a presentation to the board was about the fact that many of the greatest ideas and innovations haven't been found yet because women are not at the table, because there's no diversity at the table. And, so this is why it's really important. Some of the best things haven't been discovered. And what we need to do becomes twofold, and this is why women in construction becomes important. Women, we need to change their mindset about that they belong, but we also need to change the mindset of the industry that women also belong, and that places need to be created for them to actually feel like a sense of belonging and not just like a checkbox, like let's put a woman in here, check a box. We have to actually build it so that they feel like they're a part of it, that they're wanted at the table. So it's twofold, really.
Well, it's interesting you say that because, I've seen some women that I've invited to come on the podcast be very hesitant. A lot of times the men, oh yes, I'll get in front of the camera. So you're saying that the women need to empower themselves sometimes to be that voice, correct?
Yes, and what ends up happening for a lot of women is that, if you are the only one, you feel like you're the minority voice, and you deflect to someone who you feel like looks like they should be there, or, we value their voice a little bit more. So women absolutely need to be empowered in themselves, and that's where a lot of the work I do inside of our education series is helping women understand that some of this holdback is beliefs that we have, that we carry, these external and internal factors that influence how we show up in the world. But then there's also that external factor. Like, I can shift the fact that I feel like I belong here all day long. But if we don't shift also the industry and how it treats women, in belonging, one of the things that we hear sometimes is, especially in industries where, say, the offshore, we'll hear from women sometimes, well, there was nowhere for women to change. There was no separate sleeping quarters. There was some of these challenges. So the industry has to actually start listening, to some of these challenges and make these places that are built. Because when they were built, many of the industries were just built for men.
Yeah.
And that's not wrong. It was just the time. And now, we update, right? When we know better, we do better. So it's these structural changes that change the industry to say you belong here. So then it also makes the women feel like they have a sense of belonging in there, if that makes sense.
No, it makes 100% sense. How far back do we have to go? Like, how deep down into the school systems do we have to start this conversation?
I mean, where we really need to start this, is kindergarten. There's a woman, I can't remember her name, but there's a book that just came out, a female construction worker in Chicago wrote a children's book about, it shows women in bulldozers and women in construction industries. That changes the fabric of society. So it becomes a social thing. It's a big movement. It's not something that we're necessarily going to change overnight because we're dealing with thousands of years of social and cultural conditioning. But we have to start. And so things like this, getting into schools, teaching girls and boys that they can be and do anything. We see more men moving into nursing, which was traditionally female dominated. We see more women moving into engineering and construction fields, which was typically male dominated. But what we have to start doing is looking at this, as young as we can, ultimately. Age appropriate, but as young as we can, to teach girls that, girls are still being given easy bake ovens, and boys are given, dozers to play with. So it's this stuff that,
You're an expert, obviously, in this field. What kind of tips would you give people that are in the industry, big and small organizations? What tips would you give them to encourage women into their industry?
Well, one of the big things is that they're going to need to really sit and have a strategic plan about how to get women in. Many men that I talk to are business owners, even female business owners will say, I wasn't held back. My father, my mother, I grew up in the industry, or all the men around me fully supported me, so they don't even understand some of the challenges that people who were not supported in choosing that. So creating a strategic plan, being a part of a bigger conversation is going to start this. Many people will say, I know it's a problem. I'd love to hire more women. I'd love to get more in. We can't find them. So this becomes, so then they just aren't there. But it's a side of the desk issue. And people are busy. And so they hire, we have a need for a job, we hire who comes. But it has to become part of a bigger piece in the industry. So getting involved in events like Women in Construction, being men in the room and allies in the room, but also asking for meetings, with women and saying, how can we fix this? What do we need to do? Not to necessarily fix it, but change it, right? Because, when we say fix something, we assume that there's a bigger problem, but sometimes it's just about being a part of the change. So it becomes that something has to move from the side of your desk to the middle of your desk and say, we're going to actually create or be a part of conversations and groups and organizations that help us change, some of this. So some of the work that we're seeing the board, certainly at the NLCA doing, they're interested, they're trying to get into schools, creating, probably organizations with bringing kids to work sites or teenagers, or creating work programs so people can specifically find this, and getting money. There's lots of money available, especially for women coming into male-dominated industries. So finding ways to utilize funding, to open the doors. But one of the biggest things that we have to do is we just have to change how we each view who belongs and where they belong, right?
I love how you describe it's a side of the desk item, and so many times when those things sit over there, they never get attention. You seem to be the type of person that can take these things off the side of the desk and help companies move that forward. Do you do that for companies?
Yes. So
Tell us about that.
So a lot of the consulting work that we do is we look at the structure and the strategy that's in place, look at the challenges that the company's having, and then create a plan of action for them to take forward to really, get into how can we hire more women, what do we need, what changes do we need, what structural changes do we need. So you're really working within the organization, the company itself, sometimes, I have male business owners come to me and say, look, these are some of the challenges that we're facing. How do I, it's like an advisory council sometimes of how do we deal with some of these challenges, that we're facing. How do we get more women in, but then also how do we create structures and systems? And so that's what, we essentially work on within those companies, is to say, how can we, this is my problem, how can I fix it? And let someone else who's an expert do it.
How do they get you?
You can find me on TonyaWhittle.com. I'm also, you'll find me in the membership listing at the NLCA.
New book out? Tell me about that.
I have a new book out. It's actually, the launch is today, May 2nd. So this is my second book, which I'm really excited about because it's called Life Lessons with Woman's Best Friends. So it's a book about my life with my dogs. And I kind of did that play on, man's best friends, because everything has to be through a feminist perspective for me, right? So kind of reclaiming that, because we hear a lot of stories about man's best friend and, going off traipsing through the woods with their dog and, canoeing down, rivers and all these things.
That's not me, by the way.
So I got today, so the launch day is 15 years ago, I flew to Ottawa and got my first dog. She's still with me. She's a chocolate lab, and then I had a second chocolate lab who I rescued, and she passed in November. So the book was written before she passed, and it was about our life together. Life with Labs is what it's called. And this book is really about looking at the 13 top lessons that I learned on being a better person and how to live a high quality, extraordinary quality of life because of my dogs, because of the time that we spent hiking and in the woods, and stuff doesn't matter, and unconditional love and forgiveness, and the kinds of things that ultimately will make us better people. And it's really filled with stories about mayhem, because if you know labs, and then you have two of them, life was dirty and messy and crazy. But we really, I've had an amazing life and really became who I am because of them, because of that time in the woods, that time, running free and doing these things. So that's what the book is about. And I always joke, in this, it's the book where the dog doesn't die, because nobody wants to read a book where the dog dies or watch a movie, because the book was written about our life together. So it's not really a book about loss, and I know that's a life lesson for all of us, but in this book, it's not covered. It's really just about the madness of finding ourselves, through and the lessons that our canine companions can offer us. So today is the official launch.
Where do we get it?
You can get it anywhere books are sold. You can also find it on my website at TonyaWhittle.com, but Chapters, Barnes & Noble, in Amazon, it's carried everywhere.
Tonya, I love the conversation here this morning, and I loved how you described the best ideas have yet to be discovered, and how true that is. Not only do we need more women at the table in many, many industries, but we really just need people to start doing work in the construction industry. This is a booming industry, and we need all hands on deck.
Yes, and the more diversity, the more ideas.
Right. Jerry, what do you think?
Well, we're learning a lot from you. One thing, there's a term, unconscious bias, and I pride myself on probably not having unconscious bias, but I probably do. So talking to you, you're really educating me, and I really appreciate that.
Well, I think unconscious bias, we all have. I have it. I'm challenged with it every day. I come up against my own bias all the time. We joked in a meeting that we had last week. It's not just, we talk about unconscious bias towards the way men feel about women under this cultural and social conditioning that we don't know we're operating through. But women have it towards men. Mm-hmm. We have it towards each other. We have it towards industries. We have it everywhere. And we can't get rid of it. But what we can do is become way more aware that we have it. And when we come up against these triggers or blocks, we start asking ourselves, what's really behind this?
Right.
Well, thank you, Tonya.
Thanks very much. That was a wonderful conversation, and we appreciate you being the very first guest.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for tuning in to the Building Newfoundland and Labrador podcast, presented by the Newfoundland and Labrador Construction Association, produced by GaleForceWins.